Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
My name is Will Deatherage. I am the digital content producer for the Medical Institute for Sexual Health, which is actually based out of here in Dallas. And before I get started, I'd like to give an immense word of thanks. I'll be presenting on the topic of ushering in a biblically based new sexual revolution. But I want to express my deepest gratitudes to someone who couldn't be here today, Lori Kirkendall, who put so much effort into all the research that went behind making these slides. It's not only her brainchild, but it's her heart and her soul. And she unfortunately could not make it to the conference. So I like to say that if I could do just 1/10 of the good job that Lori would have done, I'll be able to walk away from this a very happy man. So while I was on the plane flying from DC the other day, I was reflecting on who exactly am I to comment on this issue, a new sexual revolution. And, I started asking myself, well, all right, I'm a student, I'm studying historical and systematic theology at the Catholic University of America, so I have an academic interest there. I am a CEO, I run my own company, Catholics for Hire. We specialize in digital content production for Catholic and Catholic-friendly orgs. It's part of our mission to get behind initiatives like this. But I think most relevant to our situation here is I'm a friend, I'm an ally, and I'm a shoulder to cry on for victims of the old sexual revolution. I was reminiscing on how a few weeks ago a very good friend of mine called me up and said, Will, I need somewhere to go. I need someone to talk to. Something really bad has just happened, and I don't know what will happen if I stay by myself. So my friends and I invited her over to our apartment, and we had to take turns basically holding her while she cried because she was telling us about how earlier that day her doctor had informed her that she had an STD that would last with her the rest of her life. Now, this young lady, she'd been admittedly very promiscuous, often driven out of a depressed and anxiety that she felt. But my goodness, the immense amount of weight she felt after this doctor spoke with her, it lasted with her for weeks and lasts with her till this day. I also I was reminiscing on how a few years ago when I was a sophomore, I received a phone call from another good friend of mine. I was at a retreat. I think it's God's grace at work there. And this good friend of mine who'd been pro-choice her whole life couldn't stop crying, couldn't stop mourning the loss of her baby when she checked into a Planned Parenthood earlier that day and had an abortion. Like I said, despite being pro-choice her whole life, this decision weighed deeply, deeply on her conscience. So these are the kind of experiences that I think qualify me to speak to this issue. Like I said, all this research is run by the Medical Institute for Sexual Health. And without further ado, we'll just dive straight in. So there's a couple of objectives that we have here today. The first one is to understand key cultural, generational, and spiritual dynamics and opportunities unique to 2022. The second objective is to define a purpose and posture by which we can strategically uphold healthy relationships and advance biblical values for sexuality and marriage. But before we get into our plans for a new sexual revolution, it's worth reflecting on how exactly we got here today. Here we have our standard run-of-the-mill AP European history timeline. Today we'll be focusing primarily on the latter quartile, mid-Enlightenment to the Industrial Revolution, reflecting on the historical events and philosophical movements that birthed the old sexual revolution. So Lori likes to tell me that the world is run by isms, even if we're not necessarily aware of them. The first ism I'd like to talk about emerges out of the Enlightenment. Classical liberalism. Now, many of us are aware of the wonderful benefits that classical liberalism gave us. Political participation, personal freedoms, freedom of speech. But there was something else, an unintended side effect of a focus on preserving individual rights that started emerging out of this era. Primarily in the form of the family being replaced by the individual as the most basic unit in all of society. This has massive ethical ramifications when you think about it, because we move from a world that is built on ethics from community, the common good, Christian virtue, to an ethical system that tries to center on the individual needs. What I want, what I desire, what can help me. And I apologize for the oversimplification on these issues. Many of you guys, I'm sure, are aware of college courses being taught on these isms alone. But with a culture that gives primacy to the individual as the basic unit of society, can often come utilitarianism. We stop caring about my ethics and my life being defined by my traditions, my culture, my religion, my family. And we start to look at, well, what do I think benefits me? I am an individual, independent actor, just like everyone else. I look after my own needs, you look after yours. This causes, in many circles, a utilitarian mentality. Others aren't meant to be acted in the good for, or acted for in the good. Others are just there to serve my end of my own personal satisfaction as an individual agent. From utilitarianism, we get into Darwinism, whereas the former advocates for a state of nature of utility. I look after my interests, you look after yours. Darwinism propels that to a bit of a different level, a different flavor. Not only is it the state of nature that, I look after my needs, you look after yours, but it's a good thing if I do anything that is necessary for my needs to trump yours. If me being happy, in a superficial sense, or me feeling satisfied involves, plowing down the needs and wants and desires of other people, well, it's survival of the fittest, eventually evolving into Nietzsche's will to power. Around this time, there was a movement to reconstruct a broader historical narrative that could tell the human story without appealing to the Judeo-Christian tradition. Because for much of human history, as we're all aware of, human nature and the direction of human history was defined by the Bible. But with modernism, there were many historians and philosophers who wanted to reconstruct the trajectory of the human story without appealing to a higher power like God. And one of these historical and philosophical movements manifest as Marxism. If I am an individual agent looking after my needs and my wants, and I can identify someone who's in the way for me getting what I want, I am oppressed. I am a victim. Or conversely, maybe I'm a bully. Marxism reduces all of history to class warfare between oppressor and oppressed. And again, I apologize for the oversimplification on each of these isms, for which there are college courses that many of you are definitely aware of. But we'll see these pop out in our historical overview of what exactly leads up to the sexual revolution of the 1960s. So many people believe that the 60s was the true birth of the sexual revolution. We like to think that it goes a bit, before that. Trace it back all the way to the 1890s, what is colloquially referred to by many as the gay 90s, or in the United Kingdom, the naughty 90s. It's around this time period when Sigmund Freud really starts to reorient the place that sex has in society, culture, psychology, etc. Because until now, the prevailing thought is that sex is just one activity, one component that can help lead to our ultimate fulfillment as human beings, whether that be through family building, whether that be through authentic romance. But with Freud, he kind of turns the tables a bit. Rather than sex being the means to the end of broader human fulfillment, sex becomes the end in itself. And if you read Freud, you can see a lot of this writing basically stating that everything we want, everything we do, everything we desire is for sex. This leads to the rise of sexology in a lot of German psychiatry. Homosexual activism pops up around this time period. And the early suffragist movement gains traction for equal rights and opportunities. That's a good thing. That's a very good thing. But we bring it up now so we can contrast it with some later movements in feminism. The 1900s through the 1920s are morally categorized by the devastation of the First World War, especially in Europe. I think it's just unimaginable that we are so blessed here in this country to have never witnessed such destruction occur to our homeland. The amount of moral decline that occurs because of the destructive nature of the First World War is just beyond what I can think of. However, in the United States, there's a conservative pushback in the form of prohibition, social hygiene movements, and a re-emphasis on chastity until marriage as the solution for a lot of social ills. However, in other circles, there's people with other agendas. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Margaret, the foundress of Planned Parenthood. I think this quote sums up a lot of her beliefs quite well. No woman can call herself free who does not control her own body. Now, Sanger ascribed to many Freudian, Darwinian, and Marxist perspectives of philosophy and human history. She believed in, sexology, Freudian analysis, but fundamentally she situated feminism within the context of the Marxist paradigm. Not only were women historically oppressed by men, but the mechanism by which they were oppressed was their own biology. And if women want to overcome oppression, they must find mechanisms and technologies that allow them to do so, particularly pregnancy, childbirth, and raising children, in her opinion, were the main mechanisms of oppression that men used to basically shackle them to their homes, to their kitchens, to being housewives rather than pursuing careers. Between the 1930s and the 1950s, there's what we call a commercialization of this new sexual movement, more or less. We got a couple interesting figures that aren't always associated with each other. We have Alfred Kinsey, who specialized, he believed that human purpose is sexual fulfillment, very Freudian like that. And then we have Hugh Hefner up here, the founder of Playboy magazine. I was the pamphleteer, he proclaimed, specifically in reference to Kinsey's work, actually. Hefner not only believed that what he was doing with his magazines and commercialization that involved what many would call the exploitation of women's bodies, he not only believed that to be a profitable business, but he saw this as a moral crusade as well. He believed that what he was doing in terms of, allowing women's sexuality to be used in the media was liberation. This is where we see the commercial industry really start to use pornographic elements and defending it by saying, this is liberation at its finest. We're showing how women can do anything they want with their bodies, and it's totally fine. Before we get into the 1960s, we'll talk about a few more isms here. Liberalism and progressivism pop up again. Now, whereas the first movement of liberalism was largely political, by the time we hit the 60s, there's a bit of a different spin. I would say, in a certain respects, a bit of a Marxist spin on it. And the reason I say that is, whereas first wave of liberalism focuses on the political right, by the time we hit the 60s, it focuses more on my right to believe whatever I want. It's less about the ability to vote or express opinion, but it evolves into something else, that I have a right to distinguish myself from my family, my culture, my religion, my traditions, and I must enlighten myself by offloading the weight of tradition on my shoulders. Progressivism emerges from here as this notion that change is good, inherently. Tradition holds us back. I've already spoken about some of the shifts in feminism in which it moves away from political right and expressive right and more towards this idea of liberation from oppression, putting men and women at odds with each other. This notion that for a woman to be free, a woman to be liberated, she must annihilate or mitigate her biological functions that stand in her way. She must be more like man. Pluralism also arises as a logical consequence here, especially of liberalism. Sorry if I've been covering up some of these definitions. Pluralism specifically shifts the paradigm from I can express my opinions as an individual to my individual opinions are valid. They are true. My truth is just as valid and true as yours is. And what better actor to, regulate and moderate all this, ensure total equality and ensure total pluralism than the government itself and large corporations who can benefit from this. Finally, we have cultural Marxism, which I think is particularly relevant today. I mentioned earlier how, through this train of thought, you can easily arrive at a system where you categorize yourself or other people as a designated victim or bully, an oppressor or an oppressed one. This will come into play a bit later in the presentation, but it's something that starts to go away from strictly academic circles and seep into the very fabric of society. All right, let's go to the 60s. We got the Vietnam War protests going on, love-ins. Make love, not war. This isn't your standard Christian charitable love, though, because by this time, we've hit a kind of a redefinition in what love means from the Freudian psychoanalytical perspective. Love isn't about willing the good of the other in the Aristotelian tradition. It's not about pursuing charity and sacrifice in the Christian strain of thought. Love's about feeling good. It's about all those chemicals releasing up there in the head. You want love? No, that's what it is in this revolution. The hippie movement occurs, of course. Sexual orgies, drug use, and student rebellions become quite prominent in society. This is the foundation of the baby boomer generation. And there's three events that occur here that are quite instrumental in fulfilling Sanger's vision of mitigating women's biology to attain equality. The birth control pill is approved by the FDA in 1960, basically ensuring that sex can be separated from its biological purpose. No-fault divorce legalized in 1969, making divorce easier. Roe v. Wade, 1973, making abortion a right that a woman has. All three of these events are instrumental in furthering Sanger's vision of the separation between biological sex and its impacts on us in society, in interactions, psychologically, etc. And as you'll see later, they have huge ramifications that I would argue aren't so pretty at all. So there's three foundational shifts: a rejection of God. I think we can see this in a lot of data that shows a decline in Christianity and church attendance in this country. A radical change in the understanding of the nature of the human person. Like I mentioned earlier, sex has moved from a means to an end, from a way to fulfill yourself, to live Christ-like lives, and instead is the end in itself. Our life revolves around sex. We must get that. Tethered to that is number three, the separation of human sexuality from fertility. Because of these new technological innovations, pregnancy, childbirth, child raising is no longer a necessary consequence of sex. Now, the 1980s is a bit of an interesting era in this broader paradigm shift in the sexual revolution, because it marks a bit of a wake-up for many people. This notion that we can attain sexual invincibility, that we can do what we want without facing the health consequences, comes to a grinding halt with the AIDS crisis, where suddenly humanity is reminded, oh, there are some pretty dire consequences for having sex freely like that. We'll skip ahead to the present era. Sorry, we're covering so much in so little time. And, today, we're in a very interesting situation where politics and culture seem intertwined. And in 2015, the Supreme Court legalizes same-sex marriage. The Me Too movement recently sprung up, which rightfully exposed a lot of sexual abuse occurring in the highest echelons of society. Unfortunately, many media outlets decided to, exploit it and I actually know several people who've been wrongfully accused for certain gains. The age of first marriage has increased significantly. Cohabitation is still on the rise. I'll touch on social media a little bit later. And then sexual orientation and gender identity. This is, in my opinion, what would mark the fulfillment of Sanger's vision, where we can separate our biological functions of procreation from our identity as human beings. It doesn't matter what I'm born with. If I say I'm a woman, I'm a woman. Well, where are we now? We are in a postmodern society, characterized by a turn towards the self. My self-consciousness, my self-referentiality, my truth in relativism, pluralism, and general irreverence of the past and of tradition. We're in a post-Christian society. As I mentioned before, it's quite evident from a lot of empirical data that this country and much of the Western world just doesn't seem to believe in the Christian train of thought. We're in the digital age. I'll touch on that in a minute. And we're in the divided age, a huge byproduct of this larger Marxist culture of oppressor and oppressed. Well, if you can get a large group of people to come together by identifying one common enemy as the source of all their problems, it becomes incredibly easy to manipulate them. It becomes easy to get them to rally behind a specific cause. It becomes very easy, especially if you're a charismatic politician, to really weaponize this logic of oppressor and oppressed. We're divided, and politicians and large corporations use that division for their gain, and I don't think for our benefit most of the time. And we're in the lonely age. This is where I'll talk about technology. It's such a blessing what we can do with our phones and our computers and all that tech. But when we replace authentic human interaction, going up and having conversations with people, with scrolling through a Facebook feed, it just fundamentally changes the way we think about ourselves and ourselves in relation to others. Because human interaction no longer becomes about getting to know people and loving them through Christian charity. It becomes looking at people's profiles, seeking approval via likes and shares, measuring yourself in comparison to them, and seeing people at, quite frankly, their most superficial states. It causes an immense amount of loneliness. So there's all this awful stuff coming on, but what remains are truth, life, and hope that we hope can lead to a restoration of these other things. As much as we want to shove truth and life and hope and these other values into a corner, many of them still remain. They are unavoidable and unignorable. Now, Lori likes to use this image. It's of the tsunami that hit Indonesia in 2018. Now, the way a tsunami works, of course, is there's tectonic plate shifts that are undetectable. Then the earthquake hits, a little bit more noticeable. But by the time the tidal waves start to hit, it's too late. In many respects, the tectonic plate shifts could be analogous to the early philosophical movements that occurred in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Not many people were aware of those. By the time the earthquake hits, with a lot of influencers like Hugh Hefner going out there and pushing this stuff on people, well, the waves are already on their way to hitting us, and this is what we're left with. And this is the next portion of my presentation to explore what exactly is the damage that has been done. The divorce rate has gone from 16% in 1940 to 42% today. Between the 1940s and 1970s, there were only really 2 recognized sexually transmitted diseases. Now, there are over 30. Here we have another chart just illustrating the direness of this. In 2019, it marked the 6th straight year in a row in which the U.S. reached an all-time high for STDs. Gender identities, from before Christ times to the 1970s, in most of Western civilization, there were only 2 recognizable gender identities. Now there's over 30. Non-marital sexual activity is still on the rise. 57% of high school seniors have had sexual intercourse. I'll send these slides out, by the way, so you guys can look them over. There's so much information here. This one really strikes me. 450,000 teen pregnancies per year, 25% end in abortion. Goodness. STDs. Now this is a big one. Young people between ages of 15 to 24 account for 50% of new STIs. And condoms, not exactly fantastic at reducing them. Gets herpes infection down by only about 30%. Pornography, the average age of first exposure to pornography is between 8 and 11 years. We've already touched on the weakening of marriage. Again, I'll send these slides out with all this valuable information. And then, it's a lot. The wreckage is there, and people aren't happy. People in my generation aren't happy, and I can see that through the data and through my own personal experiences. Most people who I know who have sex before marriage say it nowhere near feels as good reflecting on it later than in the moment when they did it. Now, this is where we'll turn to scripture for a bit. One generation will commend your works to another. They will tell of your mighty acts, from the Psalms. I like this in particular because many of you are here to express interest and solidarity in this new sexual revolution. But it's a very unpopular opinion to have. You get canceled lickety-split for that. You're up against your employers, your friends, your institutions, the media, governments. It's a tall task, and if you make a stand for it, well, you might just end up isolated and alienated by a lot of people you know and love. But just because one generation considers you a villain doesn't mean the next won't consider you heroes. And this is for my generation and the one that is coming up right here. We want you guys to take a stand, and we want our generation to take a stand so that future generations will tell of your mighty acts. Speaking of which, we're on the cusp of a new generation, Generation Alpha, born estimated roughly between 2010, and they'll stick around till 2035. Whereas the previous couple generations were largely impacted by 9/11 and the Great Recession of 2008, COVID-19 is this generation's formative experience. And in many respects, I'd argue that this whole situation and how it's been handled, especially going all digital with our youngest, most impressionable Americans, has fostered a large amount of distrust in a lot of traditional institutions. They're primed for change, and this is an opportunity for a new sexual revolution. But who exactly is guiding our morality right now? Well, we featured one such organization, Sex Ed for Social Change, to demonstrate how a lot of these ideas aren't being done in the best interest of sexual health. There's other agendas at play. As part of this organization's statement is, well, we're after reproductive justice, LGBTQ equality, sexual violence prevention, I think we can all get behind that, gender equity. Equity is a loaded term. It goes a step beyond equality, more towards similarity, and dismantling white supremacy. It's a curious one to find in a sex education organization. And here in some of their values, they include defunding the police, COVID relief for all, reproductive rights are immigrant rights. There's other agendas at play. And if we want to build a new sexual revolution, we need to build one that is exclusively aimed at improving the sexual health of our young people. So I'll give a brief overview of what exactly it is we're trying to accomplish. It's enough history for one day. I'll go through the purpose, posture, practical strategies, and prayer. Why are we doing this? Well, I think if there's anything we can take away from this, this is probably one of the most important things of all. The greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, in a post-Christian age, it can be very easy to get frustrated, to get angry, to become resentful, to become hateful of people who we believe have hurt society. We can't let that fear and hatred control us, though. This is the be-all, end-all scriptural passage through which the rest of the scriptural canon and our mission as Christians ought to be interpreted through. And, believe me, growing up in the Pacific Northwest, I'm from Portland, Oregon. I grew up in a good Catholic household, but, just seeing what my educators had to say, what the media and influencers were saying, they cast Christianity as a fundamentally hateful and oppressive force. And when I ask why, they just show a clip of a Christian pastor or a preacher or a priest saying something horrible about the very people they claim to help. That is unacceptable. We have to be merciful, we have to be charitable, we have to be kind. Love your neighbor as yourself. I took a canon law class a few semesters ago, and those of you who are familiar with Catholicism know that we love our canons, we love our systematic theology, we love our lists of rules and all that. But on day one, our instructor reminded us, you can't do any work in canon law, you can't do any work in theology without going through this commandment first. I love this one too. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. So in a post-Christian age, it can become easy to adopt this mentality that let's just circle the wagons and take care of our own. Look, it's myself, my family, my community, we're just going to weather the storm. We'll hunker down. What everyone else is doing, that's fine. No, that's not what this Christianity thing is supposed to be all about. Jesus Christ came into a very turbulent world, and he ended up nailed to a cross for it. We are called to follow his example, not just to keep our Christianity to ourselves, but to go out and proclaim the gospel to the ends of the earth. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So I live in an apartment. I share a bedroom with 3 guys. When it's lights out and someone, turns on their phone flashlight, everyone notices like that. And I think one of the advantages to living in a post-Christian age is the amount of darkness is so great and so pervasive that the tiniest flicker of light will be noticeable. And as we'll get to later, that can help and hurt us. I wish I could cover all these verses, but time. So prevention and restoration are 2 of the things we're after in this new sexual revolution. Prevention. A wise political science professor of mine, I was an undergrad in politics, who specialized in East Asian studies, said, here in the West, we think 5 years ahead at most. Over in countries like China, though, they're thinking 50 or 500 in some cases. The solutions we decide to take against the old sexual revolution cannot hurt us in the long run. That's why prevention, having that mentality, that preventative mentality, is so important. We cannot be hasty. And restoration. We also can't get in this mentality where we give up on certain people who've been impacted negatively by the sexual revolution. We can't just look forward, but we have to look around us to who is hurting and how we can help them. Posture. So here at Medical Institute, and with our coalition we're building around the new sexual revolution, we're focused on 3 core topics that I'll touch on. Incredible, compassionate, and collaborative. I'll touch on credibility first, through some scripture. This middle passage is one of my favorites. When Gentiles, who do not possess the law, do instinctively what the law requires, these, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, to which their own conscience also bears witness. I love this verse so much because the world we live in many ways, is very similar to that of the early church. And St. Paul acknowledged that, yes, Christians, we are endowed with a very special form of revelation that came through the incarnation of Jesus Christ. But for those who did not bear witness to him or did not come from a tradition that bore witness to him, there are still the seeds of God's wisdom, his reason, planted in all of us. A note on church history: the earliest church fathers were fascinated by the Gospel of John's use of the word logos, that Christ came into the world as logos, as the Word of God. Because the word logos predates Scripture. It was a Greek philosophical term that applied to this universal wisdom that we all participate in and share. And it was incredibly useful in apologetics and evangelization for people like St. Paul and the early church fathers to say, look, the pagans, they are already on the right track to finding Christ in their lives. They don't have the gospel proper, but they have the wisdom of God, the logos that is inseparable from the incarnation of Christ at play. And in a post-Christian age, when so many young people are, they find Christianity fundamentally unattractive, we can't go at them throwing Bibles at them. We have to appeal to what we share. And what we share, regardless of culture, religion, race, background, is that universal wisdom that God gives every human being. And through there we can hope that they will be led by the grace of God to Christ. Culture making is never a solitary affair. Absolutely no one makes culture alone. Quote from Culture Making. I love this quote because Christianity in general is in a very unfortunate situation. The unity that Christ charged us with keeping is so evidently not there. And I, as a Roman Catholic, would be the first to admit that my Roman Catholic Church has done much in the past to dissolve that unity. Many of us come from different denominations and different sects of Christianity. And a part of coming together is going back to the first principles of what makes us Christian. Starting from there, not letting our differences, disrupt this unity that we need. Because if we don't come together over these basic issues that ought to be universal in the Christian church, well, the next generations will be lost. So we've got a couple terms here: collaboration, working jointly with others or together, cooperating with an agency with which one is not immediately connected, and coalition, growing together, uniting as a whole, uniting for a common end, arising from the combination of distinct elements. Hope is incredibly important in our mission. It's a messy world. Lots of awful stuff happens to some great people too. But we can't lose hope. And humility. Oh goodness. I talked earlier about the starting point of logos. How about the starting point of sin? Before we are members of the kingdom of God, because that is something that God himself knows with 100% certainty, we are sinners. And we are just as guilty of sinners as many people who've been impacted by these awful situations. So when I come across someone who says they have an abortion, I tell myself, I am a sinner as well. And that is one of the first ways to reach out to people, is to humbly acknowledge your own mistakes before even daring to engage with other people. Let's see here. Now at the same time, while going out and evangelizing is important, we have to have a firm foundation. We recall that Jesus began his ministry in Jerusalem, which expanded to Judea as a whole, to Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And I think it's crucial of his establishment, not just in Jerusalem, but of a designated group of 12. And keeping that designated group as his premier ambassadors, making sure that the leadership of the early church was basically tight and knew what they were doing and was firm in their conviction and belief. So while evangelization is important, we have to take care of ourselves, we have to take care of our leaders. Who exactly is involved with these kinds of movements? People in the education, government and policy, parents, churches, the entertainment industry, healthcare, business, all are called to be a part of this new movement. As we said before, the old sexual revolution did an excellent job at networking and connecting people from very different walks of life to contribute to one singular mission. We have to do the same. Bring up a few of these terms right here. Now, at the core of a lot of these woes is this pervasive mentality. It's this culture that separates sex from its context of marriage. That, according to our coalition that we are building, is the root cause of so many of these harmful activities that are plaguing our young people, is this notion that sex outside of marriage is just as good as sex within the context of marriage. Lori likes this image. Involves cutting off several serpents' heads here, because there's so much being thrown at us right now. You know, it's just amazing how quickly the world changes, how many fires we have to put out at the same time. But, you know, we're armed with the most powerful tool in human history: truth, goodness, and beauty. I like to call them the most marketable products, because there's nothing more beautiful than the word, the logos himself. I also like to say, though, that Christians have both the easiest and hardest job in all of human history. It's easy in the sense that all we have to do is live the gospel message, and people will follow. St. Francis of Assisi preached the gospel, used words when necessary. But it's so incredibly easy to mess that up. Because if you call yourself Christian and you don't live it, well, oh my goodness, you've just tarnished the gospel message right there. Part of this is understanding how we talk about these issues. My generation, not gonna lie, if some of you haven't noticed, is a particularly sensitive one. I take offense to that. We do not like being told not to do things, or that what we're doing is wrong. It needs a bit of a marketing adjustment on our end. There's a big difference between saying, I'm against contraception, than to tell someone, I'm for optimal sexual health. It sounds very different to say, I'm against same-sex marriage, than to say, I think every child should have a mother and a father. Or even, I'm against abortion. I am for the sanctity of life. You know, I detest transgenderism. No, I am for the intersection of sex and gender. And this one, very relevant to, I'm sure, a lot of people in this room. I am against hookup culture. I am for authentic romance. These are the positive values that people will be attracted to more than, you know, this negative ways of presenting information. I grew up in a world in which Christianity was presented to me as the religion of no. You cannot do this. You cannot do that. You will be condemned if you do this. Rather than one that was presented as something that will lead me to ultimate fulfillment and happiness in life. And that's the direction we need to go in. Oh. One way of doing this, I like to say, we need to go into the matrix. All these technologies and media channels that pioneers like Hefner mastered, they're kind of scary places, and that's coming from someone who grew up with them. You know, there's a lot to manage there. And, you know, the minute I boot up, you know, Instagram or Facebook, I'm almost overloaded with borderline pornography from advertisers, from people posting things. The internet and social media can be scary places, but that doesn't mean we should avoid them. We need to engage with these platforms that the old sexual revolution has monopolized for such a long time. And we need to convince people that there are better ways to live life, beyond both social media itself and the values that are promoted across social media. All right, lastly, we come to prayer. Now, the virtue of prudence instructs us that before we take action, we need to have an adequate amount of reflection. Otherwise, the whole project will just go down in flames. And there's a couple great verses here about prayer. Go to this one. I love this in particular. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" And I said, "Here am I. Send me." I love this because it has a very two-pronged understanding of what it means to pray. There is the listening component. We are in such a busy world, so much is going on. Finding 5 minutes to just sit down and just say, all right, God, show me, lead me where I need to go, remarkably difficult, especially for people involved in academia and administrators. But the second part is as difficult, if not harder in my opinion, to be responsive. Because if you're not responsive, just think of any conversation. If you just sit there and it goes in one ear, out the other, well, are you really listening? We need to respond when God speaks to us. I'm reminded of the story of the man whose house is flooding because of a communal flood. Car drives by and someone says to him, hop in, this whole town's going to be underwater. No thanks. I'm waiting for God to answer my prayer. He will save me. House starts to flood. He goes to the second floor. A boat comes by. Come on, man, get in. Not going to have much time. No. I'm waiting for God to save me. Gets to the roof of his house. A helicopter flies by. This is your last chance. No. I'm praying, and God is going to save me. This flood is the old sexual revolution. I've already discussed how much havoc it has wreaked on our generation, many generations. And we have to be responsive to the opportunities that God presents us. The skies won't necessarily open up where a booming voice from God says, all right, I want you to do this. Those of you who know people who that's happened to, that's wonderful, and I'm very envious. But God speaks to us in the subtlest whisper through prayer, which is why not only listening, but responding appropriately is important before acting. Prayer involves a deeper dialogue with those who disagree with us. And I'd like to close out this session with a poem that Lori actually wrote. Again, I wish she could be here so much. She calls it A Better Tomorrow. A vision for tomorrow that looks different than today. We seek a brighter future where all can live a better way. Where marriage is upheld and to all dignity is shown. Where truth is the foundation, faith and freedom by all are known. Where boys and girls are free to grow in homes where peace and love are shown. Where youth are helped to find their way, our future leaders are given hope for today. Where the sanctity of life again is held high, and healthy marriage is restored as a holy sacrifice. Where parents are empowered to fulfill their high call, and lies that threaten health and home are silenced once for all. Where leaders at all levels are guided by what's right, for the good of all and obeying our call, together we unite. Yes, a better tomorrow is what we will seek, and as Christ himself we go humble and meek. As he came to serve, we will serve where he leads. May the way, the truth, and the life be the one whom we please. For he is the one who reigns over our times. Only he is the one who can move and change lives. Go forth in power, make straight our way. Yes, Lord, come near and bring this better day. Thank you very much.